In the 1950s and 1960s, a powerful force swept the Arab world, Arab nationalism. At its center stood Gamal Abdel Nasser, the charismatic president of Egypt. Nasser preached unity, resistance to Western influence, and rejection of Israel's existence. To millions, he was a symbol of dignity after colonialism. To Israel, he represented an existential threat. Egypt became the military and ideological heart of Arab resistance, armed increasingly with Soviet weapons, though officially non-aligned. Israel, meanwhile, aligned itself with Western powers, first France, later the United States, seeking security through deterrence. Syria took an even harder line. From the Golan Heights, Syrian artillery shelled Israeli farmland below. Palestinian guerrilla groups launched raids with Syrian support. Israel responded with force. Each retaliation bred the next escalation. The cycle tightened, the rhetoric sharpened, the margin for error shrank.
The Middle East was not isolated from the world. It sat at the crossroads of it. Oil routes, trade corridors, symbolic influence in the post-colonial era. The Cold War loomed over every decision. The Soviet Union armed Egypt and Syria. Western powers increasingly saw Israel as a strategic ally. Neither superpower wanted a regional war, but both amplified the risks. Then, in May 1967, everything shifted. Soviet intelligence warned Egypt that Israel was allegedly preparing to attack Syria. The information was wrong, or at least exaggerated, but Egypt acted as if it were true.
Egyptian troops surged into the Sinai Peninsula. United Nations peacekeepers stationed there to prevent conflict were ordered to leave. Then came the decisive move. Egypt closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. Israel had long declared this an act of war. At the same time, Egypt signed defense pacts with Jordan and Iraq. Speeches grew louder, threats grew bolder, diplomacy failed. Israel mobilized, but mobilization came at a cost. Factories slowed, civilians were pulled into uniform, the economy strained under the weight of waiting. Israel now faced a choice: wait and risk destruction, or strike first and risk everything.
Israel's military doctrine was built on three principles: speed, surprise, and preemption. After intense debate at the highest levels, the decision was made. Israel would strike first. At dawn, Israeli aircraft rose silently into the sky. Within hours, they struck Egyptian airfields with devastating precision. Planes were destroyed on the ground. Runways were cratered. Egypt's air force, once the largest in the Arab world, was effectively neutralized. Jordanian and Syrian airfields were hit next. By the end of the day, Israel controlled the skies. The war had begun, and it was already turning. Israeli ground forces raced across the Sinai. Egyptian command structures collapsed under confusion and miscommunication. Retreats became routes, units scattered. Within days, Israeli troops reached the Suez Canal. An entire front had fallen. Jordan entered the war after receiving false reports of Egyptian victories. The reports were wrong. Israeli forces counterattacked swiftly. By June 7th, the West Bank was captured. Israeli troops entered East Jerusalem. For the first time since 1948, the city came under Israeli control, an event of immense political, religious, and psychological significance. The final front lay to the north. The Golan Heights, a fortified plateau overlooking Israeli territory, had long been a strategic threat. After fierce fighting, Israeli forces broke through. The heights fell. The guns finally began to fall silent. By June 10th, 1967, the war was over. In 6 days, Israel had captured the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights. The map of the Middle East was transformed, perhaps permanently. But victory did not bring peace. It brought occupation, new conflicts, new grievances, and questions that remain unanswered. The war had ended, but its consequences were only just beginning. If you found this story insightful, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, because in the next and final part, we uncover the consequences and the long shadows this war left behind.
They thought it would be easy. An empire armed with rifles, artillery, and global dominance, facing a kingdom armed with spears. But on January 22nd, 1879, everything changed. Over 1,300 British soldiers would be killed in a single battle, not by superior weapons, but by superior strategy. This is the story of the Anglo-Zulu War, a moment in history where the unstoppable empire met an enemy it completely underestimated. The land of Zululand was calm before the storm. Rolling green hills stretched endlessly beneath a golden sunrise. Villages stood quietly. Cattle moved slowly across the plains. Smoke rose gently into the morning sky. It looked peaceful, but this was no ordinary land. This was a kingdom built on discipline, on identity, and on war. At its center stood King Cetshwayo, a leader who understood both the power and the cost of conflict. He did not seek war, but he ruled a people who were prepared for it. The Zulu military system was unlike anything the British had faced in Africa. Young men were organized into regiments known as Amabuto. They trained together, lived together, fought together. Their weapons were simple, the assegai spear and cowhide shield. But their strength was not in their weapons. It was in their discipline and in their strategy. The most feared of these strategies was known as the horns of the buffalo. The center, known as the chest, would attack directly. The horns would move around the sides, fast and silent, closing in on the enemy. And once surrounded, there was no escape.
To the south, another force was advancing, the British Empire. A global power that had conquered nations across continents. Led by Lord Chelmsford, the British saw Zululand not as an equal, but as an obstacle.
This is the Queen's
They
ultimatum.
issued an
You must
ultimatum.
comply. We have heard your words.
Disband your
We
army.
will consider them.
Accept British rule. Surrender your independence. But this was never meant to be accepted. It was a justification for war.
In January 1879, British forces crossed into Zululand. 3 columns, thousands of soldiers. They carried rifles capable of firing multiple rounds per minute. They brought artillery, logistics, confidence. They expected resistance, but they did not expect what was waiting for them. January 22nd, 1879. The British camp rested beneath a mountain at the Battle of Isandlwana. There were no defensive walls, no strong fortifications, just confidence. Then something moved. High on the ridge, shapes appeared. At first, they seemed small. Then they multiplied. Thousands of Zulu warriors emerged from the hills. They had been there the entire time, watching, waiting.
The British opened fire. Rifles thundered. Smoke filled the air. Zulu warriors fell, but they did not stop. They kept advancing, closing the distance, breaking through the gunfire. Then the formation unfolded. The chest moved forward, the horns spread outward. Slowly, almost invisibly, the British were being surrounded. Ammunition began to run low. Orders became confused. Lines broke. Units became isolated. And then the collapse began. Over 1,300 British soldiers were killed. It was one of the greatest defeats in British military history. An empire that believed itself invincible had been shattered in a single day. But the story did not end there. That same day, just miles away, another battle was unfolding. At the Battle of Rorke's Drift, a small British force, around 150 men, faced thousands of Zulu warriors. This time, the British prepared. They built barricades. They created defensive lines. They stayed disciplined. The battle lasted through the night. Wave after wave of attacks. Gunfire lit the darkness. The air filled with smoke and shouting. This was not about victory. It was about survival. And somehow, they held. 2 battles, 1 day. One showed the collapse of an empire. The other showed its resilience. But beyond strategy and numbers, there were people. A young Zulu warrior stepped forward into gunfire for the first time. He watched men fall beside him. Still, he moved forward. Not because he believed he would survive, but because retreat was not part of who he was. At Rorke's Drift, a British soldier carried wounded men from a burning building. Room by room, flames rising around him, smoke filling the air. Each journey could have been his last, but he went back again and again. War is not just about victory or defeat. It is about human endurance, courage under pressure, and decisions made in moments that last forever. The British Empire could not accept what had happened at Isandlana. It responded the only way it knew how, with more force, more soldiers, more weapons.
Reinforcements arrived. Strategies changed. The British adapted. They formed tighter defensive formations. They increased their firepower. And slowly, the balance began to shift.
The final chapter came at the Battle of Ulundi. Zulu warriors charged once more. Brave, fearless, determined. But this time, the outcome was different. The British formed defensive squares. Gunfire came from all sides. The Zulu advance slowed, then stopped. The war was over. King Sechwaya was captured. The Zulu kingdom was divided. Its independence was gone. But history does not forget. It remembers the day an African army defeated one of the most powerful empires in the world. It remembers the discipline of the Zulu warriors, the courage on both sides, and the lesson that no power is truly untouchable. Because for one moment, the spear defeated the empire. By the end of the 19th century, Africa was collapsing beneath empire. One after another, ancient kingdoms disappeared. Britain advanced from the north and south. France swept across the west. Belgium carved terror into the Congo. Germany expanded through East Africa. Portugal tightened its grip along the coasts. Across the continent, European armies marched with rifles, artillery, machine power, and the belief that nothing could stop them. To the empires of Europe, Africa was no longer a continent of nations. It was territory, land to divide, resources to exploit, people to control. And by the 1890s, it seemed almost inevitable that the entire continent would fall. But hidden deep within the mountains of the Horn of Africa, one empire refused to surrender. An ancient kingdom, protected by brutal highlands, ruled by leaders who understood exactly what was coming. And unlike many nations facing colonial invasion, Ethiopia prepared to fight back. What happened next shocked the world. Because in 1896, against all expectations, an African army defeated a European empire in open battle.
Not through negotiation, not through diplomacy, but on the battlefield. The clash became known as the Battle of Adwa, a battle that shattered the myth of European invincibility, a victory that humiliated Italy, a moment that inspired anti-colonial movements across Africa and the Black world for generations. But Adwa was more than a battle. It was a declaration that Africa would not disappear quietly. This is the story of how Ethiopia stopped an empire and changed history forever.
To understand Adwa, we must first understand the world that created it. During the late 19th century, Europe entered a fierce race for territory in Africa. Industrialization had transformed Europe. Factories demanded raw materials, empires wanted new markets. National pride became tied to colonial expansion, and African land became the prize. Between 1884 and 1885, European powers gathered in Berlin to decide Africa's future. Remarkably, no African representatives were invited. The conference became a diplomatic negotiation over an entire continent. Borders were drawn, claims were recognized, and European leaders treated Africa as if it were empty land waiting to be occupied. The consequences would reshape millions of lives. France expanded across West Africa. Britain tightened its control in Egypt and southern Africa. Belgium seized the Congo with horrifying brutality. Germany established colonies in East and Southwest Africa. Portugal strengthened its coastal possessions. And Italy, one of Europe's newest nations, also wanted an empire.
Unlike Britain or France, Italy had only recently become a unified country. For centuries, the Italian peninsula had been divided into competing kingdoms and states. Only in 1861 did modern Italy emerge as a unified nation. But unity alone was not enough. Italian leaders wanted prestige, power, respect. And in 19th century Europe, great powers were expected to possess colonies. Without an empire, Italy feared appearing weak. Colonial expansion became tied to national pride. Politicians promised glory overseas. Newspapers promoted dreams of conquest.
Military leaders wanted victories that would elevate Italy's status in Europe. But Italy faced a problem. Most valuable territories had already been claimed. The race for Africa had begun late for Italy. So Italian leaders turned their attention toward the Horn of Africa. The region offered strategic access to the Red Sea and Indian Ocean trade routes. Italian forces first established footholds along the Eritrean coast. From there, ambitions grew, and soon Ethiopia became the target.
Ethiopia was unlike most African states confronting European expansion. It possessed a long imperial tradition. Its rulers traced their legitimacy through centuries of monarchy and religious authority. Christianity had deep roots within Ethiopian society. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church played a central role in national identity. The country's mountainous terrain also provided natural defensive advantages. Foreign invasions were difficult. Communication across the highlands required experience and endurance. But Ethiopia was not a perfectly unified nation. Regional nobles held considerable power. Internal rivalries often weakened central authority. And for much of the 19th century, the empire experienced political instability. That would begin to change under one man, Menelik II.
Menelik was intelligent, strategic, patient, and deeply aware of the changing world around him. Before becoming emperor, he ruled the kingdom of Shewa. He understood both Ethiopian politics and European ambition. Unlike some rulers who underestimated colonial powers, Menelik studied them carefully. He purchased modern weapons from European suppliers. He built diplomatic relationships. He expanded his influence carefully. And when he became emperor in 1889, Ethiopia entered a new era. Menelik believed Ethiopia could modernize without surrendering its independence. But he also understood something critical. War with Europe was becoming increasingly likely. In 1889, Italy and Ethiopia signed what became known as the Treaty of Wuchale. At first glance, the treaty appeared to establish peaceful relations between both nations. But hidden within the agreement was a dangerous deception. The dispute centered around Article 17. In the Italian language version, Ethiopia was required to conduct foreign affairs through Italy. That would effectively make Ethiopia an Italian protectorate. But in the Amharic version, the wording suggested Ethiopia merely had the option to use Italian diplomatic assistance. The difference was enormous. Italy claimed Ethiopia had accepted colonial status. Menelik insisted Ethiopia remained fully sovereign. Whether through deliberate deception or manipulation, the treaty became a ticking time bomb. When Menelik discovered Italy's interpretation, relations collapsed, and the emperor made his position unmistakably clear. Ethiopia would never become a colony.
As tensions grew, Menelik began preparing for conflict on an unprecedented scale. Across Ethiopia, calls for mobilization spread. Regional leaders were ordered to gather troops. Farmers became soldiers. Warriors marched from distant provinces. Nobles brought cavalry forces. Priests blessed armies before departure. Women played a crucial role in sustaining the war effort. Many carried food, water, medical supplies, and equipment across enormous distances. The mobilization was extraordinary. Some historians estimate Ethiopia assembled over 100,000 fighters. It became one of the largest African armies of the 19th century. And importantly, Ethiopia was not armed only with spears.
Menelik had spent years acquiring modern rifles and artillery from European powers. Many Ethiopian troops carried advanced firearms. This shocked European observers, who expected an outdated army. Italy underestimated Ethiopia repeatedly, and that mistake would prove catastrophic.
Despite growing Ethiopian resistance, many Italian officials remained confident. European colonial ideology had created dangerous assumptions. Across Europe, many believed African armies could not defeat modern European forces. Colonial victories elsewhere reinforced this arrogance. Italian newspapers predicted easy triumph. Politicians expected a glorious campaign. Military commanders assumed superior organization and discipline would guarantee victory. But beneath the confidence, cracks were emerging. Italian forces operating in Eritrea faced supply problems. The harsh terrain slowed movement. Morale fluctuated. And some commanders privately worried about Ethiopia's growing military strength. One of those commanders was General Oreste Baratieri. Baratieri understood the danger better than many politicians back in Rome. He knew Ethiopia's army was massive. He knew the terrain favored defenders. And he knew a reckless assault could end in disaster. But political pressure pushed Italy toward confrontation. The government demanded victory. Retreat would humiliate Italy. And so the march toward Adwa continued.
One of the most influential figures during the crisis was Empress Taitu Betul. Strong-willed, politically intelligent, and fiercely patriotic, Taitu opposed Italian expansion from the beginning. She distrusted colonial promises and urged resistance. During the campaign, she played a major role in logistics and morale. Sources describe her helping organize supplies and support for Ethiopian forces. She also represented the determination of Ethiopian women during the war. Too often, historical narratives focus only on kings and generals. But Ethiopia's resistance depended on entire communities. Women transported provisions, cared for wounded fighters, maintained supply systems, and sustained the enormous army gathering in the highlands. Adwa was not merely the victory of an emperor. It was the mobilization of a nation.
By early 1896, both armies moved toward the mountainous region around Adwa in northern Ethiopia. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving. Steep ridges, rocky hills, narrow valleys. For armies unfamiliar with the terrain, navigation became difficult. Ethiopian forces, however, knew the land intimately. They used scouts effectively. Communication moved rapidly between commanders, and morale remained high. Italian troops faced mounting difficulties. Food shortages emerged. Supplies stretched thin. Soldiers grew exhausted. General Baratieri hesitated. He knew attacking such a large Ethiopian force carried enormous risk. But again, politics intervened. Italian leaders accused him of weakness. Pressure intensified. And eventually, Baratieri decided to advance. It was a decision that would define his career and Italy's colonial future.
On the night before battle, tension filled the mountains around Adwa. Thousands of Ethiopian fighters waited in darkness. Italian troops prepared for a surprise attack planned before dawn. The Italian strategy depended on speed and coordination. Several brigades would move separately through mountainous terrain and attack Ethiopian positions simultaneously. But the plan immediately began to unravel. Maps were inaccurate. Communication broke down. Units became separated in darkness.
Officers struggled to navigate unfamiliar terrain. Confusion spread before the battle even began. Meanwhile, Ethiopian scouts detected Italian movements. Menelik's commanders reacted quickly. What Italy intended as a surprise assault was turning into chaos, and dawn had not yet arrived.
March 1st, 1896. The Battle of Adwa begins. As dawn broke across the Ethiopian highlands, Italian brigades found themselves dangerously exposed. Separated units lost contact with one another. Some advanced too far ahead. Others became trapped in difficult terrain. The Ethiopian response was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of fighters surged toward isolated Italian positions. Rifle fire erupted across the mountains. Artillery thundered through valleys. War cries echoed across the battlefield. Italian soldiers fought fiercely, but coordination collapsed rapidly. Entire brigades became surrounded. Ethiopian commanders exploited every weakness. Cavalry forces attacked vulnerable flanks. Infantry pressed relentlessly forward. The scale of Ethiopian mobilization stunned the Italians. This was not a scattered tribal resistance. This was a massive organized army, and it was determined to destroy the invasion.
The fighting became brutal. Some battles descended into close-range combat with bayonets, swords, and spears. The mountainous terrain intensified confusion. Smoke obscured visibility. Orders failed to reach units. Italian formations disintegrated under relentless assault. As casualties mounted, panic spread. Retreat became increasingly difficult. Roads clogged with wounded soldiers. Command structures collapsed. Some officers attempted desperate defensive stands. Others fled. By midday, the Italian army was breaking apart. Adwa had become a catastrophe.
The scale of the defeat shocked Europe. Thousands of Italian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Large quantities of weapons and equipment fell into Ethiopian hands. Italy's dream of easy conquest had collapsed completely. For Ethiopia, the victory was extraordinary. An African army had defeated a European colonial force in open battle. At a time when much of Africa was falling under colonial rule, Ethiopia remained independent. The psychological impact was enormous. Across Europe, newspapers reacted with disbelief. Many colonial assumptions suddenly looked fragile. The myth of European invincibility had been shattered.
News of Adwa spread rapidly around the world. In Italy, outrage exploded. The defeat humiliated the government. Political crises followed. Protests erupted. For many Italians, Adwa became a national trauma. But elsewhere, the battle inspired hope. Across Africa and the African diaspora, Ethiopia's victory carried profound symbolic power. At a moment when colonialism appeared unstoppable, Adwa proved resistance was possible. Black intellectuals, activists, and anti-colonial thinkers celebrated the victory. Ethiopia became a symbol of African dignity and sovereignty. The battle would later inspire Pan-African movements and anti-colonial struggles throughout the 20th century. Adwa was no longer just a military event. It had become an idea. Why did Ethiopia win at Adwa? The answer lies in several critical factors. First, leadership. Menelik successfully unified diverse regional forces under a common cause. Second, preparation. Ethiopia acquired modern weapons and ammunition before the war. Third, logistics. Despite enormous challenges, Ethiopian supply systems sustained a massive army. Fourth, terrain. Ethiopian commanders understood the mountains far better than invading forces. And finally, Italian miscalculation. Colonial arrogance led Italy to underestimate its opponent repeatedly. Adwa demonstrated a truth many imperial powers ignored. Technological superiority alone could not guarantee victory, especially against determined resistance supported by effective leadership and national unity.
The legacy of Adwa still resonates today. Ethiopia remained independent during the colonial era, though Italy would invade again decades later under Benito Mussolini. But the memory of Adwa endured. For Ethiopians, the battle became a cornerstone of national identity. For Africans under colonial rule, it represented defiance. For the black diaspora, it became proof that European domination was not inevitable. Even today, historians view Adwa as one of the most important anti-colonial victories in modern history. It altered international perceptions. It disrupted imperial assumptions, and it reminded the world that resistance could succeed.
In 1896, the world expected Ethiopia to fall. Europe possessed industrial armies, global empires, and modern weapons. Africa was being divided by foreign powers. And yet, in the mountains of Adwa, history turned. Farmers became warriors. Regional rivals united. An emperor refused submission. And an African nation defeated a European empire. The Battle of Adwa was more than a victory. It was a declaration that sovereignty mattered, that dignity mattered, and that even in an age of empire, resistance was possible. More than a century later, Adwa still echoes through history. Not simply because Ethiopia won, but because the battle challenged the belief that colonial conquest was unstoppable. And in doing so, it inspired generations far beyond the mountains where the battle was fought. The story of Adwa remains one of the most extraordinary moments in African and world history. A reminder that even against overwhelming odds, people who refuse to surrender can change the course of history forever. If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe for more deep historical stories from Africa and around the world. Because history is not just about the past, it explains the world we live in today.
For over 6 centuries, one empire stood at the center of global power. It spanned 3 continents, commanded the world's most vital trade routes, and governed millions of people from vastly different cultures, religions, and languages. It witnessed the fall of medieval kingdoms, the rise of European powers, and the dawn of the modern age. From the Balkans to the Arabian Peninsula, from North Africa to the gates of Central Europe, its influence reshaped history. This was an empire that adapted, absorbed, and endured. An empire that did not simply conquer territory, but built systems that allowed it to survive where others collapsed. This was the Ottoman Empire. But how did it rise from obscurity to dominate the world stage for over 600 years? And what lessons does its story still hold today? To understand the rise of the Ottomans, we must first understand the world they entered. The 13th century was a time of chaos and transformation. The once powerful Seljuk Empire, which had dominated much of Anatolia, was collapsing. At the same time, waves of Mongol invasions had shattered political structures across Asia and the Middle East. Cities were destroyed, trade networks disrupted, empires weakened. What remained in Anatolia was a patchwork of small, independent states known as beyliks, each one competing for land, influence, and survival. To the west stood the aging but still symbolic Byzantine Empire. Once the eastern half of the Roman Empire, it had been reduced to a shadow of its former self, its borders shrinking, its power fading. And along this fragile frontier, a small principality quietly emerged.
Around 1299, a leader named Osman I laid the foundation of what would become the Ottoman Empire. At the time, Osman controlled only a modest territory in northwestern Anatolia. He was not a king in the traditional sense. He did not command vast armies or control major cities. But what Osman possessed was something more powerful: strategic awareness. His territory bordered the Byzantine Empire, a weakening but still symbolically important power. This location allowed Osman to expand gradually into Byzantine lands. But Osman's success was not based solely on military conquest. He built alliances with neighboring groups. He welcomed diverse populations into his territory. He allowed a level of autonomy that reduced resistance. His followers included not only Turks, but also people from various ethnic and religious backgrounds. Many were drawn by opportunity, others by faith, some by the promise of land. Osman also cultivated a sense of purpose among his warriors, often referred to as ghazis, frontier fighters motivated by expansion and belief. This combination of strategy, inclusivity, and ambition allowed Osman's small state to grow steadily. By the time of his death, the foundation of a new power had been firmly established.
After Osman's death, his successors, particularly Orhan and Murad I, continued expanding the state. But their greatest achievement was not just territorial growth, it was institutional development. Unlike many emerging states, the Ottomans focused on building systems that could sustain long-term rule. They developed a centralized administration, a structured taxation system, a growing military organization. One of their most important decisions was to establish a permanent capital, first in Bursa and later in Edirne. This gave the state stability and a clear political center. At the same time, the Ottomans began expanding into Europe. Crossing the Dardanelles, they entered the Balkans, a region divided and politically unstable. Here they faced fragmented kingdoms and internal rivalries. The Ottomans used a mix of diplomacy, alliances, and military force to gain control. In many cases, local rulers were allowed to remain in power as vassals. This reduced resistance and ensured smoother governance. It was a strategy that would define Ottoman expansion for centuries.
At the heart of Ottoman success was its military. Unlike feudal armies in Europe, which relied on temporary service from nobles, the Ottomans developed a professional standing army. The most famous component of this army was the Janissary Corps. Recruited through the Devshirme system, young boys from Christian families were taken, educated, and trained for service. They were raised within the Ottoman system, converted to Islam, and trained in discipline, loyalty, and warfare. This created a highly skilled, centralized military force. The Janissaries were among the first armies in the world to use firearms effectively. They combined traditional combat skills with emerging technology, giving the Ottomans a major advantage. In addition to the Janissaries, the Ottomans used cavalry forces, sipahis, naval fleets, siege artillery,
Their ability to coordinate different military units made them one of the most formidable forces of their time. In 1453, the Ottomans achieved one of the most significant victories in world history: the conquest of Constantinople. For centuries, this city had stood as a symbol of resilience and power. Its massive walls had repelled countless attacks. But Mehmed II, known as Mehmed the Conqueror, approached the challenge differently. He invested in new technology, massive cannons capable of breaching the city's defences. He coordinated land and naval forces with precision. In one of the most famous military maneuvers in history, he transported ships over land to bypass the city's defences. After weeks of siege, the city fell. This event marked the end of the Byzantine Empire, but more importantly, it transformed the Ottoman state into a global empire. Constantinople, renamed Istanbul, became the new capital, a city that would serve as the political, cultural, and economic heart of the empire.
Following the conquest of Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire entered a period of rapid expansion. It extended its control across southeastern Europe, the Middle East, North Africa. This placed the Ottomans in control of major trade routes connecting Europe and Asia. Trade became a key source of wealth. Spices from Asia, silk from China, goods from Africa, all passed through Ottoman-controlled territories. The empire taxed this trade, regulated it, and benefited from it. This economic strength allowed the Ottomans to fund their military and administration. It also made them a central player in global commerce.
The 16th century marked the peak of Ottoman power. Under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire reached its greatest extent. But Suleiman's legacy goes beyond conquest. He focused on governance. He reformed laws, earning the title the lawgiver. He strengthened institutions. He supported arts, architecture, and culture. Under his rule, Istanbul became one of the greatest cities in the world. Architectural masterpieces, such as mosques and public buildings, transformed the skyline. Scholars, poets, and artists flourished. The empire was not just powerful, it was sophisticated.
One of the most remarkable aspects of the Ottoman Empire was its ability to govern a diverse population. The empire included Muslims, Christians, Jews, various ethnic groups. Rather than enforcing strict uniformity, the Ottomans implemented the millet system. Religious communities were allowed to govern their own internal affairs. This included legal systems, education, religious practices. In return, they paid taxes and remained loyal to the state. This system created stability across a vast and diverse empire. Over time, however, the empire began to face challenges. The military became less adaptable. The Janissaries resisted reform. Corruption increased. Meanwhile, Europe was advancing rapidly. New trade routes bypassed Ottoman territories. Economic power shifted. Technological innovation accelerated. The Ottomans struggled to keep pace. Efforts were made to modernize the empire. Reforms aimed to improve administration and strengthen the military. But change was slow. Internal resistance limited progress. At the same time, nationalist movements began to rise. Different regions sought independence. The empire became increasingly fragmented. World War I marked the final chapter. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers. After defeat,
its territories were divided. In 1922, after more than 600 years, the Ottoman Empire came to an end. The Ottoman Empire was not perfect. It faced conflict, challenges, and contradictions. But its ability to adapt, govern diversity, and maintain power for over 6 centuries remains one of the most remarkable achievements in history. Its legacy still shapes the modern world, in borders, in culture, in institutions. The story of the Ottoman Empire is not just about the past. It is a lesson in power, adaptation, and change.
If you found this documentary insightful, like, share, and subscribe. Because history isn't just about what happened, it's about understanding why it matters.
The Cold War is often remembered as a struggle between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. A conflict of ideologies, capitalism versus communism, East versus West. But there is a part of this story that is rarely told. Africa. As European empires collapsed, Africa emerged into independence. At the exact moment the world was dividing into rival camps, and in that moment, Africa became one of the most important and most overlooked battlegrounds of the Cold War. This is not a story of good and evil. It is a story of power, strategy, fear, hope, and unintended consequences. This is the story of how the Cold War shaped Africa. This channel is dedicated to uncovering untold stories from history, wars, and global conflicts. If that matters to you, take a moment to subscribe and let's explore these stories together. At the end of World War II, Europe was weakened. Colonial empires could no longer hold their overseas territories. Across Africa, nationalist movements gained momentum. Between the late 1950s and the 1970s, more than 30 African nations gained independence. But independence did not mean stability. New states inherited borders drawn by colonial powers, often grouping rival ethnic, religious, and political communities together. At the same time, the world was splitting into two camps. The United States promoted capitalism, private enterprise, and political pluralism. The Soviet Union promoted socialism, state control, and one-party rule. Both feared losing influence, and both saw Africa not just as a continent, but as a strategic prize. Africa mattered for 4 main reasons. First, geography. Africa sat between Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and the Atlantic. Control of sea routes, airspace, and military bases was crucial. Second, resources. Africa possessed oil, uranium, copper, diamonds, cobalt, and rare minerals. Some of the uranium used in the first atomic bombs came from the Congo. Third, ideology. New African nations were politically undecided. If they adopted socialism, the Soviet sphere expanded. If they adopted capitalism, Western influence grew. Fourth, symbolism. Winning African allies meant winning the support of the emerging, global South. Africa was not just territory, it was legitimacy. The Congo became one of the first major Cold War crises in Africa. In 1960, the Congo gained independence from Belgium. Patrice Lumumba became the country's first prime minister. He demanded true sovereignty and control over Congo's resources. But independence descended quickly into chaos. Belgian forces intervened. The mineral-rich Katanga region attempted to secede. The army mutinied. Lumumba asked the United Nations for help. When the UN refused to support him militarily, he turned to the Soviet Union. This alarmed the United States. Western governments feared Congo would become a socialist ally in Central Africa. Within months, Lumumba was removed from power, arrested, and later assassinated in 1961. Joseph Mobutu, with Western backing, eventually took control. He ruled for over 3 decades. The Congo crisis demonstrated how Cold War fears could override African sovereignty. Southern Africa became the most militarized region of Cold War Africa. In Angola, 3 liberation movements competed for power after independence from Portugal in 1975. The MPLA received support from the Soviet Union and Cuba. UNITA received support from the United States and apartheid South Africa. Thousands of Cuban troops were deployed to Angola. Angola became one of the largest proxy wars of the Cold War. In Mozambique, a socialist government faced a Western-backed insurgency. These wars lasted decades. Millions died. Infrastructure collapsed. Entire generations grew up in conflict. In the Horn of Africa, Cold War alliances shifted dramatically. Ethiopia was once a key ally of the United States. In 1974, a Marxist military junta known as the Derg overthrew Emperor Haile Selassie. Ethiopia aligned with the Soviet Union. Somalia, once Soviet-aligned, switched sides and moved toward the United States. The Ogaden War of 1977 saw former allies fight each other with different superpower backing. This showed that Africa was not passive. African states made strategic choices, sometimes changing sides, to protect national interests. Across Africa, liberation movements emerged. Many received training, funding, and weapons from Cold War powers. The Soviet bloc often supported anti-colonial movements. Western powers often supported existing governments to prevent communist influence. In South Africa, the African National Congress received support from socialist countries. Meanwhile, Western governments maintained economic ties with the apartheid regime. Cold War ideology often overshadowed human rights concerns. African leaders were not merely pawns. Many used Cold War rivalry to their advantage. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana promoted Pan-Africanism while maintaining independence from Moscow. Julius Nyerere of Tanzania developed African socialism distinct from Soviet models. Mobutu used anti-communism to secure Western support, despite authoritarian rule. Cold War aid often strengthened strongmen and military regimes, but it also funded education, infrastructure, and state institutions. The results were mixed. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Cold War funding ended. Many African states lost military and economic support overnight. Some conflicts continued, others faded. Economic crises followed, but political reforms also emerged. Multi-party systems expanded, civil society grew. A new era began. The Cold War had ended, but its legacy remained. Borders, institutions, conflicts, and alliances shaped during that era continue to influence Africa today. The Cold War did not simply happen to Africa. Africa was central to it. African leaders made choices. African societies adapted. African people paid the price. To understand modern Africa, we must understand this chapter, because history is not just about the past. It is about how the present came to be. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. By supporting this channel, you're helping us bring more honest, in-depth stories about history, wars, and global conflicts. Stay with us, there's much more to uncover.
It is often called the Forgotten War. Overshadowed by the global scale of World War II and the controversy of the Vietnam War, the Korean War sits in history as something quieter, yet no less significant. But this was no small conflict. It was a war that reshaped borders, divided a nation, and drew in some of the most powerful countries on Earth. It was a war that brought the world dangerously close to nuclear escalation. And it is a war that, technically, has never ended. To understand the Korean War is to understand the modern world, its tensions, its alliances, and its divisions. This is the story of how one nation became two, and how that division still echoes today. Long before the war began, Korea was a single, unified country with a long and complex history. For centuries, Korea existed as an independent kingdom, deeply influenced by its larger neighbors, particularly China, but maintaining its own distinct identity, language, and culture. That independence came to an abrupt end in 1910. Japan, expanding its imperial reach across East Asia, formally annexed Korea, turning it into a colony of the Japanese Empire. For the next 35 years, Korea would exist under foreign rule. During this period, Korean culture was suppressed. The Korean language was restricted in schools. Korean names were replaced with Japanese ones. Economic resources were extracted to fuel Japan's industrial growth. And many Koreans were forced into labor, both within Korea and abroad. Resistance movements emerged, both within Korea and among Koreans living overseas, but they were often met with harsh repression. By the time World War II began, Korea remained firmly under Japanese control. But the outcome of that war would change everything. In 1945, Japan surrendered at the end of World War II. With that surrender came the question, what would happen to Korea? Rather than immediately restoring full independence, Korea became entangled in the growing rivalry between two global powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. In the final days of the war, Soviet forces entered Korea from the north, while American forces prepared to enter from the south. To manage the surrender of Japanese troops, a temporary line was drawn across the Korean peninsula at the 38th parallel. The Soviets would oversee the north, the Americans would oversee the south. It was intended to be a short-term administrative division. But as tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union deepened, marking the beginning of the Cold War, that temporary division became something more permanent. In the north, under Soviet influence, a communist government was established. Its leader was Kim Il-sung, a former guerrilla fighter who had fought against Japanese occupation. In the south, with American backing, a separate government was formed under Syngman Rhee, a staunch anti-communist. By 1948, two separate states had officially emerged: the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north and the Republic of Korea in the south. Both governments claimed to be the legitimate authority over the entire Korean peninsula. Neither accepted the division as final. Tension along the border began almost immediately. Skirmishes, raids, and political hostility became common. The stage was set for a larger conflict. On June 25, 1950, the situation escalated dramatically. North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in a full-scale invasion of South Korea. This was not a minor border clash. It was a coordinated military offensive involving tens of thousands of troops, tanks, and artillery. The South Korean military, less equipped and less prepared, struggled to respond. Within days, North Korean forces had captured large areas of territory. Seoul, the capital of South Korea, fell quickly. For many observers, it appeared that the South might collapse entirely. The international response was swift. The United Nations Security Council condemned the invasion and called for member states to assist South Korea. The United States took the lead, committing troops and resources to the defense of the South. Other countries, including the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and several others, joined under the UN banner. What had begun as a conflict between two parts of one country quickly became an international war. As North Korean forces advanced, UN and South Korean troops were pushed steadily southward. By August 1950, they were confined to a small area in the southeastern corner of the peninsula. This defensive position became known as the Pusan Perimeter. It was a critical moment. If this final defensive line failed, South Korea could have been completely overrun. Fighting along the Pusan Perimeter was intense. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, but the line held. Reinforcements, supplies, and coordinated defense allowed UN forces to stabilize the situation. It was a turning point, not a victory, but a pause that created opportunity. That opportunity came in September 1950. Under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, UN forces launched a bold amphibious landing at Incheon, a port city near Seoul. The operation was risky. The tides were unpredictable, the terrain was difficult, and the element of surprise was essential. But it succeeded. The landing caught North Korean forces off guard. Supply lines were disrupted, communication broke down. Suddenly, the momentum of the war shifted. UN forces pushed inland, recapturing Seoul and forcing North Korean troops into retreat. What had seemed like a near defeat had turned into a rapid advance. With the tide turned, a major decision was made. Rather than stopping at the 38th parallel, UN forces continued their advance into North Korea. The objective shifted from defending South Korea to reunifying the peninsula under a non-communist government. Initially, the advance was successful. North Korean resistance weakened. UN forces moved steadily northward, approaching the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. But this advance raised serious concerns. China, which had recently undergone its own communist revolution, viewed the presence of foreign troops near its border as a direct threat. Warnings were issued, but they were not fully heeded. In October 1950, the war changed again. Chinese forces entered the conflict in large numbers. They did not declare war formally at first. Instead, they moved in quietly, using the cover of darkness and difficult terrain to their advantage. When they struck, it was sudden and overwhelming. UN forces, unprepared for the scale of the intervention, were forced into retreat. One of the most intense and challenging battles took place at the Chosin Reservoir. Conditions were extreme. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Equipment malfunctioned. Soldiers faced not only the enemy, but also the environment. Despite these challenges, UN forces managed a strategic withdrawal, avoiding complete destruction. But the broader outcome was clear. The advance into North Korea had failed. The war was shifting again. By early 1951, the front lines stabilized near the 38th parallel. Neither side was able to achieve a decisive breakthrough. The war entered a new phase, one defined not by rapid movement, but by stalemate. Trench systems were established. Artillery exchanges became routine. Small territorial gains were made and lost repeatedly. The fighting resembled the static warfare of World War I. Behind the lines, political tensions continued to rise. There were debates over strategy, disagreements between military leaders and political authorities. At one point, General MacArthur publicly advocated for expanding the war into China. This included the possibility of using nuclear weapons. The suggestion was controversial. Ultimately, it led to his removal from command. The war continued, but the risks had become clear.
Peace talks began in 1951, but reaching an agreement proved difficult. Key issues included the exact location of the border and the handling of prisoners of war. Negotiations dragged on for 2 years. Meanwhile, fighting continued. Finally, on July 27, 1953, an armistice agreement was signed. It established a ceasefire. It created a buffer zone, the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ. But it did not formally end the war. No peace treaty was signed. The Korean War remains, in a technical sense, unfinished.
The human cost of the Korean War was immense. Millions of people lost their lives. This included soldiers from both sides, as well as a large number of civilians. Cities were destroyed. Infrastructure was devastated. Families were separated, often permanently. The division of Korea meant that relatives who could once lived in the same country were now divided by one of the most heavily fortified borders in the world. For many, there was no opportunity to reunite. The impact of the war extended far beyond the battlefield. Today, the Korean peninsula remains divided. North Korea and South Korea have developed along very different paths. South Korea has become a major global economy known for its technology, culture, and democratic institutions. North Korea, by contrast, remains one of the most isolated countries in the world, with a highly centralized government and significant military focus. The DMZ still stands as a physical reminder of the conflict. Tensions between the two sides continue, though open warfare has not resumed. The Korean War also had broader global consequences. It reinforced the division between communist and non-communist blocs during the Cold War. It led to increased military presence and alliances in East Asia, and it demonstrated how regional conflicts could quickly become international.
The Korean War may be called the Forgotten War, but its impact is anything but forgotten. It reshaped a nation, it influenced global politics, and it created a division that still exists today. It is a reminder that some conflicts do not end with a clear resolution, that the consequences of war can last for generations, and that history, even when overlooked, continues to shape the present. A war without a peace treaty, a border that still divides, and a story the world should never forget.
Did you know that more than 1 million African soldiers and laborers served in World War II? Yet most of them were never recognized, never honored, and rarely mentioned in the history books. These were men taken from their homes, from villages, towns, kingdoms, and colonies across the entire African continent. Men who fought under foreign flags for empires that did not see them as equals. Today, we are telling their story, their courage, their sacrifice, and the injustice they faced. This is African soldiers in World War II, the hidden heroes. Before World War II began, almost all of Africa was under European colonial rule. Britain, France, Portugal, and Italy. These colonial governments had already created African military units. The Senegalese tirailleurs in French West Africa, the King's African Rifles in East Africa, the Royal West African Frontier Force in West Africa. When the war erupted in 1939, Europe turned to Africa for manpower, for labor, for resources, and for strategic bases to launch their campaigns. From Senegal to Kenya, from Nigeria to South Africa, Africans were called, and many were forced to fight under foreign command. By 1945, more than 1 million Africans had served the Allied war effort. British colonies raised huge armies: Nigerians, Ghanaians, your UGNDNS, Kenyans, Malians, Zambians. The King's African Rifles fought across East Africa and Asia. The Royal West African Frontier Force marched through the deadly jungles of Burma. French colonies recruited tens of thousands more. The Senegalese tirailleurs, one of the largest African forces in the entire war. They fought in Europe, in North Africa, in Italy, and in the liberation of France itself. African soldiers served as infantry, as drivers, as engineers, as cooks, as porters, as stretcher bearers, and as frontline fighters. They faced deserts, jungles, stout monsoons, and bitter European winters. Behind the numbers are real men with real stories of extraordinary courage. Berry Gozi, South Africa, at Bardia under heavy enemy fire. He crawled across the battlefield to rescue wounded soldiers. He became the first black South African to receive the military medal. Lucas Majosi, South Africa, a stretcher bearer at the Second Battle of El Alamein. He ran into enemy fire again and again and again, carrying wounded men to safety. Even after being wounded himself, he refused to stop. He received the Distinguished Conduct Medal, one of the highest awards for bravery. Job Maseko, South Africa, captured by German forces in Tobruk. Forced into hard labor, he secretly built a small bomb, placed it on a German ship, and blew it up. A prisoner who sank an enemy vessel, these men were heroes, yet their names are rarely known. But the truth is painful, even as they fought for the Allies. African soldiers were often underpaid, undervalued, and underfed. White soldiers received higher pay, better uniforms, better medical care, better housing. When the war ended, many African veterans returned home without their wages, without pensions, without recognition. The worst injustice came in Thairoy, Senegal in 1944. African soldiers who survived Europe and returned home expecting their pay protested peacefully. The French army opened fire. Dozens were killed, dozens more wounded. Their only crime was asking to be paid for their service. African soldiers were crucial to Allied victories. In North Africa, they fought Italian and German forces across deserts and mountains. In Burma, the 81st and 82nd West African Divisions moved through J. Angles so harsh that even seasoned British troops struggled to survive. Their resilience, endurance, and discipline were widely praised by Allied commanders. Yet, after the war, their contributions were quietly erased from many Western history books. Their names, their divisions, their sacrifices faded into silence. But the war left a deep mark on Africa. Many veterans returned home with new ideas about freedom, equality, and self-rule. They had fought for liberty in Europe and returned to lives under colonial rule. Many joined or inspired the movements that would lead Africa into independence through the 1950s, 60s, and beyond. Today, we honor them not as colonial subjects, not as forgotten soldiers, but as heroes of global history. If you learned something new today, share this video. Leave a comment with the name of an African hero you think the world should know, and make sure you subscribe so more people can discover the real history of our world.
Somalia, a nation rich in culture, history, and resilience. But in 1991, everything fell apart. A dictator was overthrown, and what followed was a brutal civil war, famine, and decades of chaos. Today, we'll explore what caused this collapse and how Somalia has endured one of the longest and most complex conflicts in modern history. This is the story of the Somali Civil War. In 1969, Major General Mohammed Syed Barre seized power in a military coup, just days after Somalia's elected president was assassinated. He promised progress through a system he called scientific socialism, a mix of Marxist ideas and Somali nationalism. At first, things seemed hopeful. Barre launched mass literacy campaigns, improved infrastructure, and pushed for a unified national identity, free from tribalism. But under the surface, things were cracking. Barre's regime grew increasingly authoritarian. His secret police crushed dissent, and while he preached anti-clan rhetoric, he favored his own clan behind the scenes. The turning point came in the 1977 Ogaden War against Ethiopia. Somalia lost badly. The economy collapsed. Foreign aid dried up, and resistance movements, especially clan-based militias, began to rise. By the late 1980s, the North was in open rebellion. In 1988, Barre's forces bombed the city of Hargeisa, killing tens of thousands. Many now viewed him as a dictator who had to go. In January 1991, after months of fighting, Syed Barre was finally driven out of the capital, Mogadishu, by a coalition of rebel groups, most notably the United Somali Congress, or USC. But what should have been a moment of victory quickly turned into disaster. The opposition couldn't agree on who should lead. Former allies became bitter enemies. Two key figures, Ali Mahdi Mohammed and General Mohammed Vara Aidid, both claimed leadership. Fighting broke out between their forces. Mogadishu descended into a battleground. Clans armed themselves. Warlords took over neighborhoods. There was no police, no army, no government, only chaos. And across the country, other regions followed suit. Somalia had collapsed into a patchwork of warlord territories. As the war dragged on, Somalia faced an even greater crisis: famine. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Crops were destroyed. Aid convoys were looted. By 1992, over 300,000 people had died from hunger. The world finally responded. The United Nations, followed by the United States, launched a humanitarian mission, Operation Restore Hope. Their goal was simple: deliver food and restore order. At first, it worked. Aid reached the starving. Militia checkpoints were dismantled, but tensions soon rose. General Aidid and his forces viewed the foreign troops as occupiers. Clashes began. In 1993, during a raid to capture Aidid's top men, 2 U.S. Black Hawk helicopters were shot down in Mogadishu. The battle raged for 17 hours. 18 American soldiers and hundreds of Somalis were killed. The incident shocked the world and was later portrayed in the film Black Hawk Down. After the Black Hawk Down disaster, U.S. forces pulled out. By 1995, the UN followed. Somalia was once again left to its fate. With no central authority, the country fractured further. Pirates ruled the coasts. Militias ruled the streets. And new Islamist groups began to rise, including al-Ittihad and later al-Shabaab. Meanwhile, the northern region of Somaliland declared independence, though it remains unrecognized internationally. Puntland also declared autonomy. Every attempt to create a national government failed. Clan rivalries, foreign interference, and power struggles doomed peace efforts again and again. Since 1991, Somalia has experienced waves of violence, foreign interventions, and fragile peace talks. Millions of Somalis fled the country, forming a global diaspora. Yet they never forgot their homeland, sending billions in remittances back home. In recent years, there have been signs of hope. A new federal government was formed in 2012. Somalia's economy is slowly rebuilding. Youth in Mogadishu are opening businesses. The flag flies again, not in war, but in hope. Still, challenges remain: al-Shabaab insurgency, political instability, and poverty. But the Somali people, both inside and outside the country, continue to push forward. If you